Okay, welcome to lecture number 3. Now, before we start our discussion of requirements definition, which will take the majority of the rest of the course, we need to talk about various types of life cycles. You've probably encountered life cycles already. Life cycles are models that describe the life of something that has a defined start and end. One example would be biological life cycles. An organism has a beginning when it's born, an end when it dies, and a life in the middle. What makes this a life cycle is that when the organism dies, it releases the resources of its body to serve as fuel or food for other organisms. So we can see a cyclical process there. Now, that's just an example from the everyday world. There are also lots of life cycles that we encounter in business, and in business analysis specifically. As you progress in your career, you may hear the terms defect life cycle and process life cycle, etc. This just means that the things in question are finite, that they have a beginning and end, and that one thing tends to lead to the next. Today we're going to be talking about several of these life cycles at a summary level, and we're going to start with the systems development life cycle. First of all, no one ever says systems development life cycle. They usually say SDLC. What is it? Well, from our discussion just now, you can probably guess. It's the process by which systems are created, operated, and eventually shut down, or sunset, as they say. Whether or not this is an actual cycle is a semantic matter. That might be a good blog post someday. There are two competing classes of SDLC in widespread acceptance today. One, probably the most common, is the Waterfall class. The other is Agile. Neither of these classes represents a single SDLC. Neither, frankly, should we view them as distinct classes. There aren't any bright line delineations between the two. And I personally view SDLCs as falling somewhere on a continuum between perfectly waterfall and perfectly agile, like you see on the screen here, with the little circles representing SDLCs of actual organizations. So let's take a look at waterfall first. In a waterfall model, you typically have a chart that looks something like this. The typical stages of the waterfall model are just as depicted. There is the conception phase, where the idea for the system is created. Next is requirements, where the functionality and other necessary attributes of the system are defined. Design is next, and that's where the technical design is drafted. Following that is development, where the actual coding of the system takes place. After development, we have testing, and that's where the code is tested. And finally, we have implementation, where the code is put into production, where it's operationalized for use. The waterfall models tend to consider these as distinct phases. That means that one phase cannot begin until its predecessor is complete. So, for example, the requirements phase can't start until the conception phase has finished. How do we know that each phase is complete? It depends on the model, but almost always there is some artifact produced that, when accepted by stakeholders, evidences the end of the phase. It's very common on these projects' plans to see milestones like design complete, requirements complete, that kind of thing. There are a lot of criticisms of waterfall, mostly centering on their rigidity and lengthy time to deliver. Nonetheless, most of the systems that are in use today were developed using waterfall models, and lots of management teams are most familiar with and comfortable with those models. On the other side of the spectrum, we have Agile. Agile originated as a better way to do software development several years ago. The Agile classes of SDLCs have their philosophical basis in the Agile Manifesto, which was drafted in 2001, and an excerpt of which is shown here on the screen. With respect to business analysis and requirements, it's interesting to note that while Agilists value comprehensive documentation, the second point there, they place a higher value on working software. And, well, that makes sense. People value the product more than the documentation about the product, I would imagine. Accordingly, there is usually little focus on requirements documentation in Agile projects. There's much more of a focus on having meaningful conversations and capturing the key points from those discussions. This doesn't detract from the need for business analysis at all. That's actually still quite important. It just changes the details of how requirements are captured and the overall style of the work. Agile projects also have considerably less emphasis on phases and plans in general, where waterfall projects tend to create a big detailed plan up front, and that's called predictive planning. Agile projects tend to have more lightweight and adaptive plans. There is a little planning up front, and then planning is done collaboratively by the team, adapting to changes as they come up. I won't go into too much more detail about SDLCs here, except to mention that I'm going to try to be lifecycle agnostic in this course. Later, when we're talking about documentation styles, I'll mention some particulars of waterfall and agile projects, but the core of what we're learning today works in either class of SDLC.